infrastructure, both technically and culturally. That's the way I would describe it. Now, the movement itself has been an extension of the Venus Project, coming from the mind of Jacques Fresco as a researcher. This isn't just his worldview for what we call a resource-based economy. He is, of course, 94 years old now. I think most people listening might be familiar with him. If not, he's a social scientist and industrial engineer, and his life work has been to think about how to make culture and society sustainable, whether you're dealing with city structures that are self-contained, that are very, 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 very reliable. In other words, they're very, very efficient. They operate in ways that our cities do not operate whatsoever, with clean energy and all the things I think a lot of people hear about with environmental concerns today, but are not put in practice. And a holistic systems approach, which is very, very important if we're going to survive on this planet. You can't have all this detachment occurring that we see today. And then on the other side, he discusses culture quite specifically and what it means to have sustainable values. So the influence, which sparked in Zeitgeist Addendum, my second film, of Jacques Fresco, it was a trigger to create the movement and to say, well, this guy's got some wonderful ideas. And again, he is a composite. This isn't just his ideas. I want to make sure people understand that. We're not following anybody, but we are directly linked to their data set and the work that he has done and compiled. And our organization as a movement is to move forward with this and try to get the public on board. And I will complete with this, that the goal as of now is to create critical mass in all countries towards this type of direction, known as a resource-based economic structure. And we're doing pretty well with that, with about 500 chapters and sub-chapters across 60, 70 nations. While we're still in our infancy, my hope with my new film, Zeitgeist Moving Forward, will give another spark to this interest, and hopefully we'll get so many people across all borders unifying the world that eventually a pressure will emerge and we can start to push all governments to get on board with a truly sustainable vision where the world works together, as opposed to this conflict-driven world we have today, which can only lead to our self-destruction and is getting worse, I might add. Things have not gotten better. Armament spending across the globe is substantially rising almost on a yearly basis as of now, since September 11th, and everyone's armed to the teeth, just waiting for these problems to emerge where they have to go back to war. And, I'll just say this, World War III isn't some fantasy. This isn't some idea that somehow the wars have ended while we have small pockets and energy wars like Iraq and Afghanistan and the Middle East. We're reaching a point now where we have depleted certain resources to such an effect that we'll have a real war. I don't consider Vietnam, World War I, World War II to even be real wars, even though that's obviously debatable for many different reasons. The intent of those wars is very, very different. The new war that could emerge, if the world doesn't grow up and begin to work together and share its resources, will be a war for survival of the countries on this planet. When China can't get the petroleum it needs, when Russia can't get the petroleum or any other natural resource that it needs desperately to maintain its system, when the United States hoards everything and finally takes over the Middle East, finally invades Iran, what's going to happen when these superpowers come head-to-head over energy? And this will be a real conflict. So I'll stop right there.
Interesting. So in your view, certainly with what you expressed, and as we know as well, you're looking at the third movie as a centerpiece for building a stronger counterforce, if I may.
Well, I call it the social immune system. I look at the society as a holistic system. I look at the human species as a single organism. We are intrinsically social, and we work together whether we realize it or not. We have a tight tie to each other. And what we find is that there's a cancer in our social organism, which has been rising, and this is what the economic system, in fact, is. It's a cancer. It's been growing. It's been exploiting. I will figuratively say that Wall Street is a tumor. This system continues to spread, completely decoupled from natural resources. The founding fathers of the so-called free market never anticipated the most important job, the most high-paying job in the world to be a hedge fund manager, which is what it is today. People that contribute nothing to society, that move money around on top of money through interest. and make money off of margin and everything else that goes on in that game. These are the most rewarded people in our system now, which is utterly decoupled from where we should be if the free market was supposed to actually work. So the new film is the rise of the social immune system in my mind, where people are hopefully will be educated on what we're talking about. They will realize that the economic structure is the central originator of most of the social problems we have, whether they're cultural or whether they're physical or whether they're psychological. It is the incentive motivator. It is what puts everything in motion, and we are bound by it, and we can't change anything until we override this economic structure. So yes, very quick answer. The film hopefully is a call to action. It's going to be, what's the point of communication anyway? I don't make films because I find them entertaining. I make them because hopefully they'll serve a role. And hopefully more artists out there will think about that and do the same.
Right, you're using the vehicle of artistry as a means to express greater thoughts and pose the problems that are very real.
Yeah,
there's no question about it. Give us an extended view of what the chapters are there to do, pretty much in this. Are the chapters the ones that are going to eventually take their own initiatives, create their own paradigms within the construct of what is the Zeitgeist movement and the ideals of Zeitgeist? How do you see that?
I'd say you pretty much stated it very well. The chapters really are the movement. I mean, while we have central tenets of the movement, which can be found on our website, the global website, the movement is, of course, emergent and it's adaptive, and there are many levels to it. But the chapters themselves really are the movement. They are where things reside. They are where the actions begin. They are the network. They are the ones that will unify the world. The ideology is what it is, but I encourage people over and over and over again that if they support this direction, to either start a local chapter in their area if one does not exist, which is a very simple thing to do. You could just simply make a website and it will be published, and hopefully people in your area will find it. And then eventually you have actual meetings, you have actual conferences, and as things get larger and larger, for example, in Canada, we've got a really robust group in Canada that's doing great work. The United States tends to be falling behind Europe in general as of now in Canada. London, of course, is very active. Their chapters are everything, and I want to reiterate that. So yes, it's pretty much what you just stated. The tenets are there, but there's a flexibility. The chapters, of course, can pay attention to regional problems as well. One of the things about the movement that people don't quite get, and they say, well, why aren't you guys going out raising money for poverty, or why aren't you having volunteers in some type of manner where it will help people in the short term? And what I say is that, well, that isn't the intent of the movement explicitly. We want to find the root causes, sort them out, and make the public focus on them so we can actually get past the global poverty epidemic, so we can actually get past the energy issues. There's nothing more depressing to me than going into a supermarket or a bodega when they have these little cardboard things, where you stick in a quarter to help starving children across the world. And what a miserable idea. I mean, this is what we're doing to try and help people. It's sad and pathetic. And if we want to change something like, I'll just use the example of poverty. You want to change poverty, you have to change the economic system. That's what causes it. They have nothing to do with resources. It has to do with the political constructs built around the economic protocol for self-interest, which is what this system essentially perpetuates as a value. So chapters are not obligated to refrain from such practices. And I want to make that very clear because often it's confused, such as the events of September 11th, which are just around the corner in New York City. Obviously, I was there for September 11th. People come at me all the time and they say, well, is this we know your position on 9/11, Peter. Well, are the chapters supposed to be 9/11 truth people as well? And I say, well, not exactly. And there's a reason for this. When I say this, if we are to be seen as a 9/11 truth movement, suddenly we become very, very narrow. Suddenly, the view of the movement in our holistic sense that I just described is not seen by the media. It's not seen by those that come in contact with us. So it's a very delicate balance. And I don't tell anyone what to do per se, as long as they respect the central tenets, as long as they keep the broad worldview that we want to share and get everyone to understand. So I rambled a little bit on that, but ultimately the chapters are critically important, and that's where this movement actually resides. So that.
Well, yeah, I guess actually you did. You went in before I had the vision. Why don't we stay on it still for a little bit? How does one identify tactical maneuvers towards a strategic objective? How would you identify that?
Well, since our strategic objective is to get people at this stage, the most important issue is to get people to understand the economic structure, to understand the monetary system, to understand the causality and the consequences of this system, which are multifaceted and work on multiple levels, both psychologically and structurally. To do that, you have to be very, very informed about what the economic system actually is, first of all. So you can't just passively say, oh, well, this problem with so-called capitalism or the free market or the monetary system or the Federal Reserve or the fractional reserve system. You can't just ramble on out with those ideas. You have to actually coherently describe, usually in the context that's relevant to the conversation you're having. So strategy is always contingent upon who you're speaking with in the context that they're familiar with. So parallel values is how you communicate. At least, well, that's how you communicate in the sense of the most efficient communication, excuse me. If you can find parallel values with people, so you, say for example, you go to a protest that's against the wars, okay, an anti-war protest. You can go there and pretend like they do and then, protest the war and put down the administration and all these things. Or you can say, listen, wars have been going on for thousands of years. Why is that? Why are these power establishments continually doing what they're doing? What is the lowest common denominator of most wars? And for those that are informed on the issue, you'll find there's two reasons. One is for resource grabs, and second is for business generation for economies, both isolated economies, and for those that are above economic structures, usually within the banking system, that play both sides, which is very, very common these days, that fund both sides in the sense that they actually will make money off of commercial sales on both sides of whatever given conflict there is. This was rampant in World War I, rampant in World War II, obviously rampant in the Iraq War from many different angles. So we have to understand what we're talking about, and that's the ultimate form of strategy. And sadly, people aren't yet completely familiar with all of these ideas, and they can't give examples for it. So very often you end up in circles at times. But I just want to reiterate that people need to be educated before they go into any of these circumstances. So, but not to meander here, you have to have parallel values. You have to seek out what people will find in commonality, and then you have to try and we're not talking about entertaining people. We're not humoring people. It's just basic communication. There's this sort of fantasy that I can go out there and I can talk the way I would talk to myself, if you will, to anyone, and it's going to work. That's not how human communication operates. Everyone, when they speak to each other, starts to slowly, whether they're conscious of it or not, to slowly bend their rhetoric to try and match the rhetoric that's coming from the other party. So that's for another conversation.
I think Peter, what you said is very, very important. I think the chapters and everybody listening should really take hold to what you just said, which is there needs to be this more profound education in terms of knowing the answers to the questions inside and out, looking for the problems, and really doing deeper studies. I don't think there's any question about that. I just have one last question on 9/11 for you to just I would think that a lot of the people that certainly in New York chapters and other places have come to a certain level of consciousness through the 9/11 movement, and the fact that the criticism that's been levied at the systemic problems of government terrorism and how they see themselves in the world in this new paradigm. So how do they adjust to not just moving forward and looking at the RBE as the paradigm, of course, that they'd like to achieve, but how do they coalesce? How do they build coalitions with these people to bring them forward towards that end? Do you get that?
They bring coalition.
How do they move towards coalition with other people that are in the 9/11 troop movement that have not yet gotten to where they are now? Because they are themselves eminently a byproduct of this whole movement of consciousness, this movement of looking for a shift in paradigm.
Okay. Well, I on many different levels. Even if you don't even view it from the standpoint of a false flag, even if you hold a traditional mindset, it still is a wake-up call on multiple levels. But I won't go into that side of it. Essentially, the way I see this is a huge amalgam of ideas that were spawned because of that event. Some of them are more correct than others. There's a polluted rhetoric that exists now in the 9/11 truth movement where there's associations that be created. And I'll answer your question more specifically, but I think this is relatively important because it talks, I'm referring to parallel values here, where it's been blown out of proportion. And this sort of us against them mentality has emerged where suddenly, we all know this rhetoric by now, the term New World Order has almost been interchangeable with the rhetoric towards 9/11 in many communities. And this is a very big problem because it really reduces the causality to some ancient and traditionalized notion of group warfare. So you have this subculture now that's very dominant, which is jumped upon with the media, that, the 9/11 truth movement are a bunch of crazy people who think there's a massive world government conspiracy, and it's this rhetoric that's put forward by various personalities. I won't even name their names.
We know them, and everybody knows them. Certainly those that are involved know them.
So I find that to be a very incorrect and unsupported and dangerous worldview, and it's put into, it's almost a religious view in my mind. But let's step farther back. You have this group that understands that the governments, and they finally figured out, hopefully, that the governments have been using false flag pretexts for years and years and years for inciting warfare. You can go back to the USS Maine, the Gulf of Tonkin, the Lusitania. Whether they were deliberate or contrived after the fact is irrelevant. They're still being used. And I hate to say it, but I can assure you, and it probably won't happen on U.S. soil, there will be a war pretext that will get the U.S. motivated towards Iran as well. It'll probably involve Israel or something. Who knows? But this is how they operate, is how they've always operated, as a very, very old strategy. In fact, you can go back much farther than the U.S. history and find examples of this strategy used in European nations much earlier. Anyway,
in Germany as well.
Absolutely, obviously. Even before that, though, it's very long
history. Yes, without question.
So to understand that, of course, is very, very important, because the more people that understand that, and this is where I think the strength of the 9/11 truth movement resides, is that the government knows that they can't do it anymore. The Black Operations Department, if you will, because we're not talking about the U.S. Congress. We're talking about an underground Black Operations unit that has been around, that exists in almost every country, that's responsible for all the coups and everything we hear about. By the way, if anyone wants to understand my disposition thoroughly, if they're confused on where I stand, there's 70 pages devoted to the event of 9/11 in the companion guide for Zeitgeist, the movie, first film, which can be downloaded for free. So you can read that if you want to understand my general intellectual academic perspective. But as far as the social placement of it, outside of the importance of governments knowing they can't pull this off anymore without tremendous suspicion by the public, there's really not much that can be done, in my view. I feel that it's the Kennedy assassination all over again. And what do we learn from that? We learn that government power is what it is. They control information. Doesn't matter how many people come forward in certain contexts, there's not enough of them to combat, at least not usually, to combat the media that can overshadow them like a towering oak tree on a little flower. So it comes down to the question of, do you want to put your energy into this, and is it going to give you any type of reward in a socially progressive way outside of the general awareness of war pretexts that are used to bring war into a publicly supported position. So the bridge that I find with the 9/11 truth movement is to say, listen, there's a reason for wars. There's a reason why these wars have existed, for resource grabs, geopolitical realignment, and essentially mafias at war is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with countries which are nothing more than mafia structures. We're dealing with corporations, which are just another form of mafia. And this is what the world has come out of it. These are gangs. So we think it's normality. So how do we get the gangs to come together? And that's the real question. The central root is, how do we get the world to stop fighting, to stop having to initiate these war pretexts for their own self-interest? If the world shared their resources, there would be no reason for the black operation of 9/11. There would be no reason for the need of heavy armament and geopolitical alignment of the Middle East in favor of the West to protect the energy resources for their own benefit. There'd be no reason for the dramatic conflicts of Israel and Palestine that continue to this day, that are given this facade of religious dispute when they're actually political, and religion is used by the political institution for their own means. We have to find the root causes and go after those root causes. And the only way that this transition is going to happen is a very slow value shift. The people saying, I refuse to participate anymore with any of these conflicts. I mean, the old adage of, oh, what if there was a war and no one showed up? Well, that is essentially my worldview, which is why at the end of Zeitgeist Denim, I say, don't ever join the military or let anyone you know join the military, because it is not an establishment that works for your benefit or the benefit of any long-term progressive interest. It is, anyway, I'm not going to go on that particular tangent.
No, I think the point is made. Yeah. Well, let me just ask you this, because I think something that I picked up on in your last little talk that you had in through Skype, you remember? Yeah. And you coined something which I thought was somewhat different and a break, where you said that what we're having right now is a virtual class struggle. Is that correct?
Yes, and in so many words, I could probably clarify that. I don't use that phrase in the sense that we're at war with anybody.
Okay.
Per se. The class struggle exists as a systemic problem in my mind. That doesn't mean, of course, there aren't people that want to protect what they have, and the wealthy that will engage policy that favors the rich, as we see almost administration after administration, with the tax orientations and the general breaks that are given to the rich while the middle class does everything. But what we're faced with is a self-imposed system structurally, which is actually more relevant than the psychology. As a typical example of a structurally induced imposition, we have this banking system which gives interest rewards based on how much money you hold in a given institution. So if I have $1 million and I put it into a institution at a 5% dividend or 5% interest or a CD, I can get back $50,000 a year for contributing nothing to society, simply by having that money in a position where essentially other people are using it, but just keeping it there. So what you have is you have money given to the wealthy just for them being wealthy. Then simultaneously, you have the poor, or you have the middle class, actually, which have to take loans for their homes, they have to take loans for their cars, they have to take loans for just about everything. It's almost impossible. No one pays cash for anything anymore. And what do? They pay in the interest. They essentially pay the interest that's transferred to the millionaires that take the interest out for their own benefit. So what do you have? You have a self-imposed structure that makes sure that there is perpetual class division, makes sure the rich continue to get richer and the poor either stay the same or get even more poor. So I hope you understand that. And that's a very, very critical thing. And that's just one example of this structurally imposed class relationship. Essentially, in the end, the psychology will have to be overcome as well, which is the second point. And because it's unsustainable. You can't expect society to maintain any balance. You can't expect people to respect each other and to consider each other equals and all the things that would actually make for a balanced, sustainable, peaceful, egalitarian system when self-imposed class relationships are structurally built in. This is a dramatic problem. So, but going back to my statement on that particular Skype call, I'll restate the general logic of the way I see the progression of humanity, if you will. We started with tremendous division. Well, I take that back. Hunter-gatherer societies were an entirely different paradigm. But once we started to divide up things, we felt that there was a necessity for power,
the accumulation of goods.
Absolutely. The great pirates, which were later called the conquerors or were later called the great explorers. These were guys that would go from the east to the west and bring goods back to their kingdoms. They were bringing actual physical raw materials, which gave them tremendous power. And this created even more division, created power structures, it created the financial system. So anyway, I won't go on that long tangent. And slowly through time, we've ended up with what we have today. But we slowly there's been equalization occurring because we see there's a demand for it. Slowly, racial tensions have broken down over the course of the past, I'd say, 100 years. Women allowed to vote. Granted, I don't put much gravity on voting in this system, but still, there's a gesture towards equality that we've been moving towards. Slowly. We see this almost self-progressing phenomenon where everything is equaling out amongst the human society. And I believe the next level, even though we have a long way to go, the next level is class. We have to really understand that Class is inadvertent racism. Class is nothing more than a division mechanism that creates conflict and unsustainability. And the practice of hoarding for some, and the practice of some having nothing, which we consider normality in this programmed, socially Darwinistic world, we think is socially Darwinistic when it's truly just imposed, with the assumption of scarcity and everything else. This cannot be sustained. And that's really the ultimate deciding factor. It doesn't matter what I think is a value. It doesn't matter how peaceful or how loving or any poetry I might have. The ultimate question you have to ask yourself is what is going on now sustainable? That is the long world view. And I hold that view towards values. I hold that view towards infrastructure. I hold that view towards relationships. I hold that view towards anything I come in contact with. That is the ultimate qualifier. I hope people can walk away with this interview with that in mind. It isn't what you care about. It isn't what you like. It doesn't even matter what we want. The question is, do we want to survive? Yes. And if that's the case, what attributes of our society are actually sustainable, and are they optimized in their sustainability? I went on a bit of a tangent there, but I hope you...
No, that's fine. That's fine. I think what you did, you really sort of, with that last question, you're cutting to the chase and you're telling people, pose real problems. Look at the world for what it is.
Yeah.
And look for real answers.
Right.
I guess the thing that I'd like us to move in since is the Venus Project is the proposal, because you have concretized, sort of visualize a world of tomorrow that can begin today.
Yeah.
And why don't you expand on that?
Well, the first misconception about the Venus Project is that it's some just creative notion, that it's the whim of the social engineer Jacques Fresco. What's brilliant about the Venus Project, which is essentially the data set, if you will, for a resource-based economy, it's what comprises the research that Jacques has done for 70 years, both compiled and personal scientific research, exploration in laboratories towards energy and everything else, is that it is a ground-up approach of viewing the world as a holistic system, which it is, and respecting the fact that it's a holistic system. I mean that both as an ecosystem and as a biological system for what it's generated for the different species. You can't consider the Earth in a detached way, which is why countries are an ill-gotten notion, but I won't go on that tangent. What you have is the planet as a holistic system. It has resources everywhere. What is the lowest common denominator of our survival at this point? It's obviously nutrition, water. Of course, we can extend to higher forms of energy to create the modern societies that we understand today. But once you break what we need down into the basic components, you see that the most important thing we need to do, and this is the foundation of a resource-based economy, is to manage intelligently everything we have on this planet. And this is something that you can go to hunter-gatherer societies still in the Amazon, and they are more intelligent than we are because they actually understand this fundamental concept. The unfortunate reality of today is we become completely decoupled from natural processes. In fact, some people are so cynical towards anything that deals with nature that they give them these labels. Like, I've been called New Age, or I've been called hippie, just because I reference the planet. Ooh, imagine that. Imagine referencing natural law. Imagine actually caring about what we have. You know, the moment, it's just amazing to me. That's an aside, how people have become so decoupled. They have no idea how food's even acquired in the system. They have no idea where anything comes from because they're so detached. Anyway, so a resource-based economy starts with the lowest common denominator: energy, resources and processes too. So if you have multiple resources that need to come together for a particular outcome as a process to help humanity, well, then you're dealing with systems. You're dealing with systems theory, is what you would call it in technical sense. And until we organize society holistically in a full system which manages resources and diligently creates production and distribution protocols based on resource management and efficiency and sustainability first, not human need, not human want, not human value, well, we're in a lot of trouble. We cannot impose what we want on the planet. We have to listen to it, both from the state of what it has and both from the angle of the processes that it puts forward. You know, I've said this many times. I'll say it again because I think it's a great example in this sort of overtly overtly freedom, or this illusion-oriented freedom, ostensible, the word ostensibly freedom-oriented rhetoric we see around the world today, especially in these kind of selfish U.S. manifold, where everyone thinks they should have the freedom to do anything and everything as though that's some type of value. No, nature is essentially a dictatorship. Nature, you can't get people together and vote to outlaw gravity. You can either pay attention to what the natural order is and learn from it and extrapolate it and adjust your values accordingly, or you're going to suffer. And this is, of course, a pivotal part of the value shift we talk about in the Zeitgeist movement. So the economic structure of a resource-based economy starts from the ground up and builds a systems approach to all attributes that we know today, giving the, ultimately there would be no duplication in the system. I'm going to jump ahead here, but there would be you wouldn't have companies that compete with each other making the exact same products over and over and over again, usually with planned obsolescence, so they can make more and more money off servicing and the people repeatedly buying their products. You'd have people come together. Imagine all the cell phone companies right now coming together and making the best that would last, the best materials. They take foresight in understanding what changes will happen through technological advancements, because of course that changes very rapidly, and they would build updates and they would build an infrastructure concept to each product so it would be updated. You wouldn't have to take everything and throw it away and buy a new one. Just go to the landfills and see the piles and piles and piles and piles of cell phones. Millions and millions, if not billions at this point, of cell phones that have been trashed over the course of, past 15 years now?
Oh, yeah.
Well, waste upon waste upon waste. This is gone.
Sort of an anarchy in economics.
Well, if you want to think about it that way, sure. We're not talking about a free market system. We're talking about people coming together and working for the betterment of everyone. And I don't mean that poetically. I mean that in a structural sense. So not only do the best of the best be created, not only does everyone come together and work, and people say, of course, and they'll throw this caveat in there. They say, oh, but if people aren't competing, they'll have no motivation. No, their motivation is so they can have the best too. Imagine having a computer enclosure that can last 40, 50 years without having to buy a new computer and then trash it because something goes afoul in it, and having the computer actually be updatable, or having your phone updatable, having sustainable practices, having everything to be as optimized as possible, as efficient as possible, and all of this stuff can be put into, in fact, a computer system, which can gauge all negative retroaction. People that are cynical on the resource-based economy idea will say something like, oh, you're talking about a computer running everything. That's not at all what we're talking about. We're talking about using advanced technologies for our own betterment, so we can actually take in the variables that are necessary to make proper decisions. The human mind, unfortunately, has limitations. Doesn't matter how many people you get into a conference room to brainstorm. One computer efficiently programmed can reach solutions that this group simply cannot in a faster and more efficient way. It's not necessarily creative at this stage anyway, but it's a tremendous tool. So the resource database is what will eventually emerge, which is a total tracking of every resource on this planet, not to mention the algorithmic protocols of how to utilize the resources in the most efficient way. And I can go on many different angles of this, from understanding the periodic table to understanding how elements combine, which is a completely technical process, meaning that, say, alloys can be created as substitutes for other metals that are actually growing scarce. The more you think about this, and I could literally talk for hours on just this subject, and I'm actually going to create an economic model pamphlet very soon, which will be on the website, to describe in extreme detail. It's also going to be in my film too, but in a more loose sense, because it's very technical. But to describe in extreme detail what we're talking about and how obvious it is. It's self-generating efficiency once your goal is to be as sustainable as possible. And then the human construct becomes secondary. And I know this might sound strange, but as I stated, we have to listen to the planet. We can't. I did an interview a while back, and I stated very simply that people are going to look back in the future, and they're going to look at what our practices were. They're going to say to themselves, "You mean they were taking all their precious natural resources and they were putting them into corporations which were using the worst deliberately, and that they were competing with each other and making the same thing over and over and over again? You mean they were taking fossil fuels, which they knew did not renew anywhere in the period of their lifespan, and they're using them as fast as possible to generate GDP? You mean people were buying cars simply so other people could get jobs, even though they're wasting resources on all the duplicity? You mean everyone wanted to have a car, even though they sat at driveways for 85% of their life? They're going to look back and wonder, how could we possibly have been so unsustainable and so impractical in our practices? And I think that's just an important worldview to consider.
Well, we were primitive at that time.
Exactly. But I hate to. It sounds very condescending when you say stuff like that, and I really don't mean to come off that way. But once you step back far enough and realize how backwards, literally backwards, everything is. One simple notion on the economic model I want to reiterate is that our entire global economic system is based on consumption. The only way you can fuel GDP is based on people constantly consuming. The only way you can have employment, and of course we have an unemployment epidemic that is not going to go anywhere for a very, very long period of time. In fact, I believe most of the jobs that are out now are not coming back. And the corporations are going to move towards automation because they have to. They can't afford to do otherwise. Humans are too expensive in the view of the corporation at this stage. But this is what the system is. So consumption fuels employment. And I'm sorry to say that's not going to work. While we propose this system at this stage as though it's a secondary system, as though it's just another idea, the dictates of the breakdown that's occurring in society today all point just acutely as a solution to a resource-based economy. You can no longer have labor for income if you expect the population to actually be employed and survive. We're going to move towards a larger welfare state. Obama's going to have to push in extended benefits for God knows how long. It's going to be, which is already done. Exactly. It's going to be FDR all over again. 10 cities are popping up across this country. We have, anyway, I think everyone here that's paying any attention knows the problems that we're faced with. And the only solution is a complete and total systemic change. And that's all we can hope for. And that's hopefully what we can accomplish with the Zeitgeist movement.
Well, let's see if we can take some questions. Peter, would you like to take some questions? See if I can find some members in the chapters or people that are listening. And the best way to do this is to get into the room with Peter. And the telephone number to use is 212 200 6000 6000. And then when the woman starts speaking, you use an entry code, and the number is 991-824-POUND. 991-824-POUND. And again, the telephone number is 212 200 6000. An entry code after the woman starts speaking, you put in 991-824-POUND. You'll be able to join us in the room, and then we'll set up a system. We already have a system in place, and I'll call out 3 names, and then people will give their names and so on and so forth, and then we'll give them a chance to talk to Peter. Anybody else in the room right now? Nobody else so far? Very good. There's a point that you made, Peter. I'm sorry? I thought somebody was coming in the room. Anybody that does come in, when you come in, you could just state your name, and then, and you would ask, and then we'll give you the chance to ask a question.
Hi, actually, my name is Key. I'm in the room.
Key, good morning. How are you?
Good morning. I'm doing good.
Well, you're in the room. You're free to ask questions, sir.
My question is for Peter. I guess I wanted to elaborate a little bit more on this whole 9/11 issue we've been talking about. And I guess the way that I see it is that, society or people as a whole, they have to reach certain levels of consciousness before they can even be, I feel, introduced to ideas such as the Zeitgeist movement. I mean, I'm a Zeitgeist member, NYC myself, and I guess I personally feel that 9/11 is one way to sort of introduce to the general public sort of the different levels, the society that we really live in. That I feel that people have to come at least to that level of understanding about the world that we live in, so they can even accept something such as, resource-based economy. And I guess I wanted you to elaborate a little bit on that, because I understand the Zeitgeist movement is the broader view, which I hold as self. But I do feel there are certain levels that people must reach, and I feel 9/11 is sort of that stepping stone, that universal stepping stone, at least for America, that I think will be very, very useful. Can you comment on that?
Yes, I agree in general. The role of 9/11 truth, in my mind, as I stated earlier, is to both bring false flag pretexts to the public knowledge so they can know what to expect from their governments when they continue to do this, call them out on this when they do it, hopefully stop them ultimately. And then simultaneously, it also shows how corrupt governments can be, or certain attributes of governments can be. And I agree with you in the sense that it's more nails in the coffin of the value system and the power structure as we see it. And since human beings are motivated by biosocial pressures, meaning it takes a great deal of severity, if you will, for many people to change their views. They don't just, most people unfortunately don't think rationally, they think emotionally. They hold on to identifications. It's an unfortunate evolutionary baggage we have. So I completely agree with you. 9/11 is a shock when people finally realize what it was. And it does serve a role to, as I stated, to get people to really, really question what's going on around them. But it's also very isolated in it as a tool. And let's get down to the root causes, as I stated earlier. What is it for? It's for generating conflict. It's for moving and getting support of the public for more conflict. And of course, on the 9/11 front, not only was it the Middle East wars, but now we have this gigantic fantasy known as the war on terrorism, which is just as idiotic as the war on drugs, which essentially is what it replaced. And what we have here is all this fantasy built around us and them mentalities, and 9/11 has been used as a tool for that. And I completely agree with you that it's a wonderful thing to get people to break out of that hypnosis. But when it comes to the zeitgeist movement, just be careful, because there's a tremendous stigma. And I'm obviously very familiar with controversy, and I don't hold back very often. But what I've seen is that the media has been able to cloud this issue so profoundly that if the zeitgeist movement is seen as a 9/11 truth movement in any capacity, it will essentially hurt our overall message. I believe that the economic system is much more important as a problem than the renegade rogue acts of attributes of the U.S. government or any government, such as black operations as 9/11. So I just want to reiterate that, because that's the association I think. I agree with you entirely. I was protesting 9/11 from 2005 on every year, and that this is it's important, but then again, it isn't a solution. So the central role for waking people up really is the economic structure, is my point. Not 9/11, even though it can help people on a certain level.
Okay, thank you. Sure, well, very good, G. Anybody else in the room? Peter, you made a point. Which was very interesting. I think it was a few months ago, in reference to a GM solution that you had. You were saying that when they were cutting back, or they wanted to sort of, they didn't know what to do. I think you offered a solution by saying that they should just, what was it, reduce their hours but pay them fully. Is that what it was?
Well, an old thing that went through Congress many, many years ago, during the Roosevelt administration, what happened during the Great Depression, is a great mirror of what's happening today. So if you are viewing history, if you're a student of history, you begin to see these parallels very clearly, which is why I brought that up earlier with the Obama administration today. And he's going to probably do very similar things if the corporatocracy allows him to do so. Yes, if they really cared about keeping people employed, and this is an aside, and I say, actually, you know what? I think this is important. I think they should do this as an intermediary step. Yes, they would break up the workday. They would make mandates for corporations. They would provide some type of subsidization. They would provide some type of incentive, monetary tax breaks, to say to corporations, okay, you guys have X number of employees working 40 hours a week. We want you to double your employees at 20 hours a week and increase the general pay scale by 35%. This is the type of proactive, of course, this would be called socialist. So for the U.S. to dare to do that, you'd have every pundit in the world, the right, and every pundit in America come out with, God forbid there's anything that helps society holistically, because it'd be evil and socialist. So, it's unfortunate, but yes, that's exactly what I would advocate if I was in any position to actually get something like that done, any type of temporal solution, yes.
Anybody else in the room? I do have one point that I wanted to make with you. I have a theory, Peter, certainly from having all the information.
Technology has totally surpassed and is on pace to continually and exponentially surpassing all the traditional systems that we've come to know. The revolution of technology is so critical, both from infrastructure standpoint and a value standpoint, because there's so much more information that can alter people's awarenesses. There's so much more accessible. Imagine the world before the internet. Imagine the collective. Imagine a world where all you got information-wise was a newspaper at your front step every day. That's it. You had no other outlet. You had media-controlled newspapers. This is an entirely new paradigm, both from applicable technologies for infrastructure and everything else, and for information flow. So let's focus on the first part, though, because that's the most critical and that pertains to your point. We should be reducing human labor as much as possible. People should not be forced into positions, of operating the kiosk at McDonald's, because not only does it rob them of their general creativity, it's actually not necessary whatsoever. I mean, McDonald's had 10 years ago, by the way, McDonald's won't exist in the future, but we're just going to use this as an example of a restaurant. But they actually think about that as another thing. I mean, here's a small tangent, okay? This system creates demographically oriented industries. I used to live in Brooklyn, in Bushwick, Brooklyn, and I was surrounded by general poverty in my area, and everywhere I looked was the worst of everything. You had the 99-cent stores full of crap. You had churches fried chicken poisoning people. You had all of this crap everywhere that should never have even existed. People should be getting good food. So to have it democratically generated, and then when you realize that the majority of the demographic in America is poor, is lower middle class, then you begin to see that we're creating all of this poisonous stuff just so it's affordable by these relatively poor, lower middle class people, which just perpetuates the cancers, just perpetuates the obesity, the diabetes, perpetuates the waste, because a 99-cent store should not exist. We should be making things to last, not just for cyclical consumption. Anyway, that's an aside. But going back to your point about labor, technology, food production, we have at our grasp an ability to make an abundance. That is before we pass the point of no return. And I hate to say it, but there is such a thing. While our savior beyond the point of no return could be considered nanotechnology, I won't go into that, but that's many, 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 many years down the road, where we can actually finally culminate at atomic structures from the ground up. It will happen. It happens on a very micro scale today. Simultaneously, we have computational powers that create neural networks through atomic computing, which use atoms. There's a few of these in existence today, but they get very, very primitive. These will generate solutions that will far exceed any type of human awareness we know today, but they're so far off in the distance that I don't even bring them up anymore, because there's no sense in trying to rely on things like that. We need solutions now. And what we do know about technology now is so profound. What we could do through automation is so incredible. In my film, I will discuss how a great majority of the occupations can be phased out tomorrow. I will show how our current unemployment levels, whatever they may be, are not going to go away, because the trend of technology is getting cheaper and cheaper, as I think many know. As it increases exponentially, it also decreases in value. The microchips are getting smaller and cheaper. The programming, the computers, everything is so much cheaper every single year. And what that means is that the corporations who use mechanization, who use hybrid, who use cybernetic systems, essentially, which is what most of these corporations do, which is, computers coupled with machines, which is essentially all of them at this stage. It's becoming cheaper and cheaper and cheaper as well. So they're not going to be able to justify keeping human labor anymore. They're not going to be able to justify having vacations and pensions. They don't have to deal with any of that once they get automated systems. So it's an inevitability. But I'm a little bit jumping around here. But back to your point, all I can say is I thoroughly agree with you, and that we're holding ourselves back from having more freedom, having more efficiency, from having literally a world that isn't based on this horrible conflict. I mean, you go back 50 years, you actually had women in the household, and this is a traditional element, you take it or leave it, that didn't have to work. The system actually allowed them to raise children and give them, hopefully, a decent value system. Now that doesn't exist. Why? Why is it that with all this new technology, people work more hours than they did 50, 60 years ago? Why is that incredible? I can explain why, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, we don't have enough time also, Peter. I would say that this is the quickest 56 minutes I've had with anybody.
Probably happy to come back on in the future if you like.
That's why I really wanted us to do 2 hours, Peter. But it's been wonderful. If you could give us a closing statement, I think everybody should be quite happy with the many information that you put out today. It's been very refreshing again.
I guess as a closing statement, I would just say that, in light of all the conflicts in the world, try your best to bring it down to a common focus, meaning what everyone shares, and root causes, because that's how you communicate with people. Everyone needs food, everyone needs clean water, everyone needs the fundamentals of life, and then when you begin to extrapolate that, you can see how everyone more or less shares the same values, and we're very much unified in that way. Our similarities across the human species are far deeper and tighter than our differences, and it's about time people recognize that and stop falling into the trap of all this division and us against them. And that's the only way a solution will be reached. That we can't do anything until we get a large number of people that understand the foundation, understand the fundamentals, and are willing to shrug off all the old traditionalized values and, I'm sorry to say, us against them attributes, reciprocation, a negative reciprocation. We got to get away from our vengeance mentality, this revenge stuff that we see in the culture. All this baggage of evolution has to go if we're gonna proceed and if we're gonna survive, because that's really what's on the table here is survival. And I'll just leave it at that.
Peter, thank you very much.